As noble citizens, we must bypass a life of dormancy and vice to pursue the generative endeavor of a hard day's work. The benefits of these pursuits are not secured by chance or charity, but through the merit of your character and the firmness of your convictions. It is you who are planting the seeds of trees whose shade you know you shall never see.
Hello and welcome.
Florida
We're back in the
7.
swamps. Yep, it's back. You know, let's get a little banjo going, a little bit of mosquito buzzing. We're back.
Oh, yeah.
It's hot. It's humid. It's Florida. It's the South, but not quite, but really more South than anywhere else. And today we are, like my co-host just said, we're doing part 7. We're going to be trying to fly through 2 chapters because we're getting to a phase where I would say you're seeing the real construction of more modern Florida as an American state, right?
Yeah.
And you're sort of seeing what that means, which I think is, sort of the core part of what we're getting at in this whole series. And before we started recording, my co-host here was talking about how many parallels we're seeing with the modern time in this story. And he's very right. And, one of them is bad faith negotiations by the United States and, creating either very one-sided unfair treaties that the other party would never agree to in their right mind, or just, pretending they agreed and then moving forward. All these tactics you see employed today, you'll see in this episode we're about to get through. But there's something that keeps coming up that I wanted to highlight, because I was thinking about this before we started recording too, and we've made allusions in past episodes to the kind of parallels between another Mediterranean state that, Americans don't compare Florida to quite as much as Italy, Israel. And the reason I bring that up is because, we talked about the sort of settlement energy of the Patriot War.
Yeah.
But I keep thinking about the way in which people are having this debate over, is the U.S. being controlled by Israel? Is Israel, manipulate?
Right.
Does the U.S. work for, this conversation's being had, and I think the savvy and correct way of understanding that is just, A, wrong, and then B, a way of absolving the U.S. of its, complicity in what's being done in the Middle East, what's been done to the Palestinians, to Iraq. Like, they're all shades of the same color.
Yeah, and as you'll see in the next 2 chapters, hopefully if we get to chapter 10 especially, they say a new kind of war is being waged in America.
Right.
Due to emerging American nationalism.
Right, and the point I'm getting to is that, this same attitude inside of the United States, that even during this period, you see it with people being like, oh, good heavens, they're doing that in Florida? Those carpetbaggers are behaving this or that. And it is the behavior of the highest levels of executive leadership of the country that you live in, doing things that you essentially, if you don't support them, you're funding them. So it's this complicity.
Right. And the same amount of self-serving and the formation of a spoil system, yet again, just the parallels to today and the current administration.
Incredible graft and corruption.
Yeah, the graft.
The thing I wrote down is that Israel is manipulating America, quote unquote, represents the same self-absolving impulses as the hand-washing and hand-waving that is done by the country at large when it comes to contemporary and historical Florida, is I guess how I would understand it. Because I think there's some differences there where it's like the historic, contemporary Florida, it's kind of treated as this those Florida, that's not a place Florida, I would never. And then your parents are there. There's this degree of being I would never want to be a Floridian, but also I either might retire there or one of my family members might live there or something like that, where it's is it a part of the country or not, right? And then historically, it's just erased. So much of the stuff we're going to talk about today is not, taught as a part of any kind of regular curriculum. in public schools anywhere, certainly. So, and maybe it is, but not to my knowledge.
Yeah,
yes,
or it's
exactly.
glossed over with such lovely euphemisms as the Louisiana Purchase, and you have the Gadsden Treaty, I suppose. And
we've reached this period of history now where the people who are doing this have a very canny self-awareness about how they will be perceived, and that's why they're doing a lot of these treaties that are essentially just, hey, cool, nice to see you. We're taking all your land and sending you to the middle of nowhere where you're going to like it.
Hey, you don't speak this language? You want to sign here on this document?
Right. Translator says this. What the document says is not that. So it's those sort of just absolute like Lionel Hutz just like bamboozling bullshit that people at the time would look at and be like, oh,
at the time,
those wily carpetbaggers. When in all actuality, this is the story of the United States writ large. This is the whole thing.
Yeah, this was scandalous at the time. Not to say that it was the norm. Like guys George Mathews and like they created scandals.
Exactly what I'm referring to.
And there was national outrage in other parts of the country. So when we retroactively look on this as if everybody just agreed at the time, let's eradicate all the Native Americans, there wasn't really a universal consensus about that.
Right. Well, I guess what I'm saying is it's like, absolutely. And it's like, I guess what I'm saying is that, like, you're absolutely right. It was scandalous. But my point is that, like, if that's scandalous, the whole founding of the country was scandalous.
But Florida was exceptionally scandalous at the time.
Yes.
People always were going, what the hell's going on in Florida right now?
Right. Exactly. That was something I wanted us to emphasize, too, is like how long-standing of a phenomena that is. Because remember, dear reader, we're not even, or dear listener, we're not even at the point where, like, this is the Civil War is happening yet. We're getting to the Civil War, and you're starting to see a lot of these characters, like, show up and start, sort of instantiating themselves and building the social structures that would really become the backdrop of the Confederacy. But the other note I wanted to put at the top of the show before we really get into the chapters is about the Spanish and Spanish colonization, because I think there's a tendency in the Allman book, and thus a tendency we've kind of adopted without meaning to, that I want to make sure to comment on in anticipation of any potential critics and haters. Basically, we are not, this story is not meant to be apologia about Spanish colonialism in any sense. It's more so about highlighting the differences in Spanish colonial society at the time when it was being brought into, when Florida was being brought into the United States, because there were varying degrees of Spanish colonial domination, and there were different structures that developed in different places, and, some much worse than others, and the Floridians just kind of had the benefit of being hard to dominate, I think, is one part of it, and then the other part of it is just geographically it's a place to be before air conditioning, and then the other part of it is just the Atlantic Ocean. Yeah,
that style of colonialism that we've talked about.
Yeah.
And the subtle differences between Spanish colonialism, French colonialism, and then later English colonialism. There's just a difference in the ability to project power across the Atlantic. And after the United States gains its own independence, it truly can invent its own new type of colonialism without even having to project power across the Atlantic that can't be competed with by any of the European powers.
And I guess the crux of this is the question of slavery, which we are very aware that at this time, the Spanish had plenty of, awful ways to extract surplus from people without having them be explicit chattel slaves, right?
Yeah, exactly. So there's a lower level intensity, I suppose. Of course, the Spanish are still benefiting in what we would say an unfair way from their colonial possession of Florida, but or any of their holdings across the Atlantic, but
Right.
There's just a difference in what they're able to do across the Atlantic at that time, as opposed to what develops later by an independent English colony now based in the Americas by itself.
And part of its ambition to extract resources. But the reality is that, like, Florida is in some ways mineral rich, but not in the ways they were looking for at that time. Whereas a place like the Philippines has a lot more mineral richness and other sort of resources that the Spanish have really, took a deep grip in, and it has a really profound effect on that place to this day. So that's part of why I wanted to bring it up, is that, like, it's not that the Spanish were a more kind of like colonizer necessarily. It's that at a certain point, the diminishing returns on Florida were such that they were not trying very hard to, keep control of it. They had just become a losing prospect for them as a colony.
Yeah, and no one else was competing against it either. So it just sort of coasted in their legal possession for about 200 years, with some brief exceptions, like when the British held it for like 12 years.
Exactly. As of 20, for 20 years, but still. All right, so I think that covers all the business at the top.
Let's jump into Chapter 9.
Let's jump in.
Governor Duval's conspiracy. So we're going to start off by talking about Governor Duval and where the Duval County gets its name from, which has Jacksonville. And at the time, Jacksonville was the largest metropolis in Florida.
Right.
So unlike Orlando today, where that is known as the big populous area, or maybe Miami, Jacksonville was really the center of all population, and that was situated in what is Duval County. So everyone knows where Jacksonville gets its name from, but where does Duval County get its name from?
Mr. William Pope Duval, which is, I think, an extremely Southern style name. Like I said, it's like none of these people are Confederates yet. But they will be, and many of them, and you can really start to see that same sort of like vibe being built here. And you're also seeing the term carpetbagger start to come into parlance.
Yeah, you already said it one time earlier, I believe.
Yeah, and
we're going to say it some more.
Because it also, it comes up after the Civil War quite a bit too. But I did not understand that before reading it. It's a phenomenon beforehand in Florida.
Yeah.
Mainly just referring to this well-connected, Washington outsider who thinks they can come in and, decide how things are going to be.
Yeah, it's a phenomenon of corruption. When you have something like a spoils system, then you have the ability to send someone from the outside to another place and give them a huge amount of power. And that essentially is what a carpetbagger is like an outsider who comes into a place and has a lot of power. And it breeds local resentment.
Can I put a little color into this?
Yeah.
Yeah, I want to put a little local color into this term, too, because truly I had not heard it very much ever growing up as a kid, or even just ever used as like kind of a joke on The Simpsons or some shit. Where I live now, there is, a museum of essentially Confederate apologia. It's an old, some sort of place where they kept slaves, like slave barracks or something. But there is a literal carpet bag in this museum, and it is I can put pictures of that. I can send pictures of that to my co-host here to put in the notes. But
we'll have to.
It's a really breathtaking thing, and the real bit of local color I want to give you as a born Floridian, as someone, a true son of Florida, the layers of suspicion of outsiders and like local sort of nativism and hostility are like an onion, in that they are kind of stinky and awful, and really, there's some real sweet stuff there if you're, know what you're doing with it. But overall, it never stops peeling away, and it's like there's always this feeling of sort of being left out of the loop, and also being, in this area where there are the people who are paying to be there for a short period of time, who essentially float the economy, and then there are the people who live on that, churn of people visiting the place they live and have this complicated hostility and dependence on these travelers. And that is a phenomenon I think you experience in a lot of places where it's like a major vacation hub, right?
Yeah.
But I think Florida especially, it's very deep-seated because you have this history of carpetbagging before you have Disney even. You know what I mean?
Right.
Before anything else, there is this history of people coming in Florida and essentially trying to rewrite society.
And so many of the heroes of Florida are carpetbaggers. That's just a reality. Especially if we get further into this story, we're going to reveal that the people who make a name for themselves and then have things named after them in Florida generally are carpetbaggers. Almost no one is actually from there.
An inherently sort of transient place. It's more ocean border than land almost, and it's situated in such a place that it's always been this geographic nexus between different parts of the Americas. And I think that that's something we've tried to establish a little bit already too. But now we're in this circumstance where we've had the Prospect Bluff massacre, the Negro Fort, as it was called at the time, the Andrew Jackson, rampage with the mysterious heated cannonball.
That involved Duncan Clinch, who is going to come up
all
again.
These characters, and
let's
introduce Mr. Duval.
Yeah,
Mr.
so
Duval.
back to Duval.
So basically, Duval went into basically build an American state in Florida, which was a place that had been essentially cut down.
Can we do the bio of Duval? Sorry. That's what I was about to do. Sorry.
No, go for it. Give me a little bio on him.
So Duval was born in a poor farming family in Virginia, and he ended up making a mark as a politician in Kentucky. And remember that Virginia is basically the center of power in the U.S., and the majority of early presidents, I think it's 7 out of the first 8, all came from Virginia and were elected there. That's just, I think, part of that phenomenon of carpetbagger that we were talking about, that people who ended up having power in Florida came from other places and had gained power usually in other places like Virginia
or from Washington, right?
Yeah, and then so after serving as governor of Florida, he joins another former governor, Sam Houston of Tennessee, to seek more famine and fortune under the Texas Lone Star flag. His victories were celebrated as triumphs of American individualism, but the federal government had subsidized his every move and his remove. He is buried in a federal cemetery in Washington, D.C. today. So they actually relocated his body because he's so celebrated in U.S. history.
He's like a fixer in a lot of ways historically, because it's you have President Jackson essentially creating this, General Jackson essentially creating this nightmare mess of Florida where there is opportunity to be had there, but after he runs away, President Monroe needs to find a replacement. And Governor Duval, already being basically a creature of Southern politics at this point, the messy morass that it is, he's ready to go. So he is put in charge of wrangling Florida into an American state and dealing with a lot of problems that were supposedly solved by the first Seminole War, as it was called. And he is the guy who essentially lays the groundwork for the second Seminole War.
Right. And if you want to call it that, here, as we said.
Yeah, there's a great section here I want to read that I highlighted to cover this exact sort of thing. So, the gathering catastrophe might conceivably have been averted had the young United States of America been a nation that kept its word. right? So, talk about modern relevance. Article 5 of the treaty with Spain stipulated that the inhabitants of the territories with which His Catholic Majesty cedes to the United States were to be admitted to the enjoyment of all privileges, rights, and immunities of the citizens of the United States. So that's the Spanish saying, hey, the people in these territories are now going to be citizens of the United States. At the time, the single largest group of Florida's inhabitants consisted of those whom Congressman Joshua Giddings called the exiles of Florida, a term which accurately described why these people had sought freedom there. No one could deny they were inhabitants of Florida, but the United States nonetheless resorted to a multitude of strategies which ensured that only white males would be allowed the full enjoyments of the rights guaranteed in the treaty.
Right.
This idea that the Indians must be expunged was not, as most people today assume, some age-old, deeply ingrained belief. It was a relatively new development in American thought, and like the proposition that all men are created equal, the notion that America's original inhabitants should be purged from the land was a brainchild of Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson had long believed that the Indians should be treated as our brethren on the same land. In January 1803, he officially proposed a policy of ethnic integration aimed at bringing together their and our settlements for the purpose of preparing them ultimately to participate in the benefits of our governments. Following a period of cultural and economic assimilation, Jefferson predicted in a secret message to Congress the Indians would incorporate with us as citizens of the United States. That was before Napoleon offered his deal. By July 1803, Jefferson, abandoning his prior convictions, had decided to use the acquisition of Louisiana as the means of tempting all our Indians on the east side of the Mississippi to remove to the west. The question then, as later, was what means of temptation would work. As Florida would show, Jefferson's rhetoric would not turn the trick. Jacksonian violence would be necessary. So,
yeah, and so as you said, Duval, when he began after the short 6-month stint that Jackson had been governor over Florida, Duval swoops in and begins to try to fix many of the problems that Jackson had been complaining about, such as the fact that Florida, there cannot be a profit made in Florida, as he says,
right,
or something like that. And
not easily, yeah.
And then depending on whether or not you want to actually consider one continuous war, as I've seen online, many Native American tribes that were affected say it's not the first and second Seminole War. It was one continuous Holocaust against our people.
Which makes sense when you read these events described.
So
you really, it's pretty clear.
Really all that you see is a shifting in gears between the first and second Seminole War, because when Duval swoops in after Jackson's short administration, it becomes less about overt violence and more about tricking them to get them off of their land by getting them to sign some sort of forced document or saying that they're not good to their word, giving them the reputation that would later be called Indian giving and things like that. Yeah, if you want, though, we can now move forward to what Duval did when he was responsible for setting up the institutions that would prepare Florida for its statehood.
Yeah, I mean, so he set up the councils. Well, there were already councils that met between St. Augustine and Pensacola, but people would die trekking the wilderness between these places. Which there's so many there's so many details like this that have to be It's like I love this story because I am kind of obsessed with the way in which geography informs history, and you see that constantly in this story because there's all of these people with all these modern pretensions being faced with this essentially hybrid swamp desert of death. Yeah,
it says politicians drowned.
Modernity on, right? It's just constantly killing them for so long, and the people who live. That's the thing is there's a sentence I'll get to later about how the Seminoles saw the white people that really gets to the heart of it. It's they seemed insane in their unwillingness to recognize the supremacy of nature. and the environment.
Yeah.
And their desire to conquer the world and take everything to be theirs.
Right.
Like, it seemed like absolute poisonous madness.
Yeah, based on that, it seems to them that it's logical that they should just get a place that's equidistant from St. Augustine and Pensacola after a few politicians had died.
People keep dying. Going between the two councils. So
they're trying to find a place, and Duval names 2 commissioners to search for the site. And it takes a Pensacola commissioner, John Lee Williams, 23 days to reach St. Mark's, a distance of about 215 miles.
Right.
Then St. Augustine commissioner William H. Simmons soon found a locale that delighted them, and in part it was because it didn't look like Florida at all. As they said,
I gotta tell. Let me tell the story of this. I have this section highlighted here too. So this is these guys finding this beautiful area that's not a part of like the whole limestone desert basis of Florida that is so barren inside. It's like scrub country and for the most part.
Yeah.
And it's also important, there's people living here. They've called this a similar story in the Northeast, too, where it's like, it's so nice and abundant because people
are living
growing food there. Yeah, this is their home. This is where they get their food. So let me read this passage. So the most prominent of these entrepreneurs, a well-respected landowner originally from Georgia, was named Enemathla and of Creek origin. And there's another, there's the layers to this are so complicated as far as the indigenous stuff too, because there's the Creek, the Seminole identity itself is complicated, and then the Creek and the Seminole don't always get along. So that's true with any indigenous population. But anyway, so upon their arrival at Tallahassee, Enemathla received his 2 visitors with every courtesy. Following a feast, young men entertained the visitors with a ball game. Only after having become recipients of these kindness did Simmons and Williams inform Enemathla that he and all his people would have to give up this land and all they built and possessed there and be transported to some other place.
Quite the dinner guest.
America would decide where. Americans would decide where later. I know, it's like funny games. It's like a
hey, thanks for dinner. You have to leave.
Yeah, this is ours now. Yeah. Meantime, they inform their host he and his people should prepare to abandon their vegetable gardens, their cotton fields, and their stands of sugar cane, because these 2 visitors had decided this land should become the site of the white man's new city. Enemathla proposed a diplomatic solution. The land around them was almost unpeopled. Surely these 2 wise gentlemen, if they only searched a little more, could find an even better site for their settlement. Simmons and Williams went through the motions of complying. Then they informed him that no, they had not found a place that better pleased them.
It's almost like a ceasefire negotiation today or something.
Yeah, dude, that's a good comparison, honestly. But it's it's like they're like okay, well, we'll look, and then they come back.
Looked,
and
we don't want anything.
Everywhere else sucks.
Everywhere else sucks. So... we gotta have this one.
Yeah, so that is just the beginning.
That's just the beginning.
Greedy nightmare land grab, like my colleague just said here, essentially extended genocidal land theft campaign that, I guess it's not exactly the beginning, but especially when it comes to the dispossession of the indigenous populations of Florida.
Yeah, you're seeing more and more the negotiation tactics of a group of people who doesn't consider the other party to be human at all. So they don't have to go about the motions of actually looking for land. They're just going to tell them, we looked and we don't want anything else. We want this land.
And the sovereignty of these people is not something that should be up for debate, period, full stop. But the Spanish, their former oppressors, did grant some amount of legal sovereignty to these people. And not that should be, not that, again, it's that's not what should have made them sovereign, but in theory, that should have meant something to these people. And it was explicitly supposed to. That was a part of the negotiations. There are, in fact, indigenous populations in the, South America, region on the other side of Mexico, near Panama, in that area, that are living on lands that were granted to them by the Spanish under similar agreements to this day. And they're extremely hard to access, inhospitable lands. So that's part of why they're able to hold on to them. But it really is something that speaks to like the struggle for sovereignty and to, preserve your way of life that these people have been up against for so many generations.
Yeah.
And, you got to respect. You got to pay the respects for the people who have been able to survive. That is its own form of, rebellion, as meager as it may seem. So
yeah, so the Seminoles are summoned in September 1823.
1823.
They're summoned to Moultrie Creek.
Moultrie. We're coming up on. So this is a little south of St. Augustine, and after we're talking about the finding of Jacksonville, this is like Governor Duval's real bamboozling that he does is the Treaty of Moultrie Creek, where you have the guy, James Gadsden, who is like a part of rebuilding the Prospect Bluff.
Yeah, Prospect Bluff after it was destroyed, and it gets named after Fort Gadsden for a while after him for rebuilding it. He's promoted to colonel and then even to a general at some point. And in 1822, Gadsden quits the U.S. Army. On orders, he had searched Florida for the best places to establish more U.S. military installations. That had allowed him, at taxpayers' expense, to identify the choicest spots for real estate speculation. Resigning his commission, Gadsden set out to cash in on the contracts he had made in the military.
Well, and then, so what happened as far as the Treaty of Moultrie Creek is that Governor Duval needed to make something like that happen. Gadsden had the skills and contacts to make it happen from his already, antagonistic relationship with the indigenous community. So he essentially is the one who orchestrates like getting all of these indigenous nobles, Seminole notables specifically, to come to meet at Moultrie Creek with the, governor of Florida, Governor Duval, which is this historic meeting that does not appear. It's fascinating too, I'll tell you, because I'm not from Georgia, but we really do need to do a whole separate episode on Georgia, but it's very foundational in Georgia's sort of like founding mythology that there were, we were pals with some of the indigenous guys that were here. No, it's like I never knew this, but when I was in Savannah, I was seeing this everywhere that like there were very notable like relationships that make their way into some of like the signs and plaques everywhere you go of like very specific names that are escaping me at the moment. But you see a similar sort of borrowing in Massachusetts and other places like that, although it's a little more nameless. That's the thing that sort of sticks out to me. But this event we're describing here of more than 350 of Florida's, non-white Seminole leaders converging in Moultrie Creek to meet with the essential governor of Florida, Governor Duval, which, remember, we talk about governor of Florida now like it's a real job, but this is one of the first guys to have that job, right?
Yeah.
This is one of the first people that says, like, this is an American state, thus having an American governor, and I am that guy. So,
right. And here, basically, the point of the U.S. negotiations is to turn the Seminoles into their own collaborators of their own dispossession, to basically get them to sign a document which they can't read, and then to blame them, and even to impose quote-unquote punishment on them when they break the treaty or when they end up going back on the treaty because they were forced under false pretenses to sign it.
Well, it's a process of self-absolution, like I was talking about at the top of the show, where it's like you hand this treaty with absolutely impossible and untenable terms to the person you're ostensibly trying to negotiate with, and they say, no, I'm not going to give up everything I have for nothing. And you say, well, it looks like they refuse to negotiate, and I have to fight. And that is the...
And then they find a few of them, and they say, oh, well, a few of them agreed that for $50, they will all leave. And so now that this guy agrees, everybody else is going to be held to this one guy's agreement, even though he only got $50.
Right. So... And that the Anamathala guy,
he's made the leader.
Is at this. Yeah, he's at this event. It's more like he's seen as like a spokesperson, and all the white people are like, that's the king.
Yeah, the delegation chooses him as the spokesperson. Yeah, and you're right. Probably the Europeans thought of him as the king, seeing that, even though it probably was more of a decentralized type relationship.
So I highlighted this passage. Let me read it. Which is, at Moultrie Creek, Anamapala and the others, for the first time, were presented with the American ultimatum. It proved that they would be stripped of all human as well as property rights. The undersigned chiefs and warriors for themselves and their tribes do cede and relinquish all claim or title which they may have to the whole territory of Florida, was the way Article 1 of Gadsden's text put it. At a stroke, the rights guaranteed to these inhabitants of Florida by the treaty with Spain were abrogated, ostensibly at the request of the victims themselves. Gadsden's document went on to specify that the Seminoles, once removed from their lands, were to be concentrated and confined in a barren, landlocked wasteland in central Florida. Governor Duval himself described it as by far the poorest and most miserable region I ever beheld, which, again, a little bit of southern flair from Mr. Governor Duval. Mr. Duval. So the choice of the words concentrated and confined is obviously very striking, I think.
Yeah.
And really speaks to something we've said about violence in other episodes. Just that, like, to remove a population from A to B.
Yeah. This is an inspiration, too, to later dictators like Hitler.
Yeah.
Who actually
absolutely, yes.
Looked at this positively, the treatment of the Native Americans. And saw that as an inspiration and the concentration camps. Yeah, for Lebensraum. We've talked about that also previously.
I think we've said it on other episodes, or maybe it's been a part of this series, but it is something that must be, repeated endlessly, which is that when you hear a person talking about how we just need to remove this population and take them to somewhere else, that person's talking about killing a mass group of people,
men, women, and children, cleansing.
Intermittently. Because even if they get exactly what they're describing, which is, basically what they're trying to do with the current immigration system, there is a myriad of violence that is a part of that. Just at the bureaucratic, even
just transporting them from location A to location B is the Trail of Tears.
Right. A person being told, hey, this place where you live that you were planning to keep living, you're not allowed to live here anymore, and now you need to go live somewhere else. That is not good for anyone. That's a very hard thing that you need to be very careful before you force that onto anyone's life, because it's going to profoundly affect it, generally for the worse. So that's just the reality of that. And then depending on the specific circumstances, it's genocide, most of the time that's what it is.
Yeah. Allman talks about in either this chapter or the next, how it really is a tripod of injustice that's created in order to uphold this white oligarchic rule on behalf of a very small number of people. It actually takes dispossessing the Native Americans and forcing them off of the land. It takes enslaving black people from other parts of the world and owning them as slaves. And it even takes tricking the white people who are really just going to be middle class or poor themselves and not really enjoy the benefits that the oligarchy at the top enjoys. So it really is a tripod of injustice. I think that's a good point that he makes.
Well, and one of the important parts of the tripod, you have Governor Duval, you got James Gadsden, and then you have Colonel Gad Humphries, which is
the
another
Indian
very,
agent, as they called them.
Yes, agent of Indian Affairs, which is a organization that I'm certain has a very ugly history if we were to get much more into the specifics. But in this specific case,
there's going to be several throughout this tale we're telling, the next two chapters. Yeah. Several Indian agents. Gad Humphries is the first of them, and probably the best, I'd say, of character.
Right.
None of these guys are going to be perfect by any stretch, but he's the one.
All pretty bad guys.
Yeah, they're all pretty bad guys.
These are all pretty bad guys.
It's almost like the job they're doing is bad.
Yeah, there's a pretty long procession of just bad guys doing bad stuff here for a while. So it's unfortunately that's how this story will be.
So their job is ostensibly to represent the Native Americans in the negotiations. Right. But of course, in these negotiations, these guys are actually self-serving, corrupt white people basically trying to, self-serve, I guess is the best way, graft. Mm-hmm. And Gad Humphries is no exception. He starts trying to make his own personal connections and trying to benefit from the situation, but he ultimately does start to recognize the humanity of the Native Americans. So it's very much like, could quite possibly be one of the inspirations for like the story of Dances with Wolves or Pocahontas or any of those types of stories. He certainly is that sort of character that kind of had a change of heart while he was in this role. And that's why he doesn't really last long. He's going to get replaced at some point by someone who can
Governor Duval?
Not Duval. I don't believe he's going to get replaced by Fagan next. And then
Fagan's
later
next, right.
Someone else. But we'll get to them.
Well, that's the thing. The thing about this in the next chapter is that it's really like the same story told twice with like different characters, and then just increasingly less confidence from the indigenous population, because in this chapter, like I said, it's like this really is an interesting scene in Florida history where it's like you have a pretty big grouping of the like leadership of the Seminole population showing up to meet with the leadership of Florida who are trying to, or the leadership of the United States who are trying to become basically the new governors of Florida. And there's a section here I want to read in a second about how this is shown in history textbooks. But another detail I wanted to highlight, too, is that by the time the Seminoles left Moultrie Creek, obviously they were, quite upset about what was being imposed on them and, basically essentially begging for what meager, rights they could get to like education for their children. But one thing they did ask for is, the right to have like a blacksmith and to be able to, use those sort of modern tools.
Yeah, because they were modern now. They needed plows to plow the land.
Exactly.
They had been modernized, I should say, and were accustomed to many of the modern advancements in technology that white Europeans also had become used to.
It gets to the complexity of the Seminole identity, which, again, I'm no expert in by any stretch. I'm just some white guy from Florida. But the character of Osceola, when we get to him, I think is a very good way to understand the Seminole identity a little bit as this sort of like cross-section. And
it's not exactly it's not a Native American tribe
in the same sense
as the other ones.
It's a little more different.
It's a little different from that because it truly was born in opposition to American nationalism. It didn't exist as a tribe prior to the American aggression that started to push both Native Americans and freed black slaves south, or others may not have been freed but had escaped. And there they had, for several generations, gone on to breed together, I guess, and intermarry. And so they created their own society that was not quite Native American. And that's why the figure of Osceola that we'll get to doesn't quite fit in with either society. He can't really go fit in with Native Americans, but he can't fit in with white people either. He has nowhere else to go, no other identity he could have except to be a Seminole.
Yeah, and that's very Florida for you. So that's something I'm excited to get to. But I want to read this. Yeah. So this is the story of Governor Duval and Anamathala as it was told in A History of Florida by Carolyn Mays Brevard.
Brevard. And we're going to get to her Brevard in a later chapter even more.
Yeah.
I don't like her, just like Washington Irving. I think there's good reason why you're not going to like her by the end of this series, too. But anyway, read that quote.
So the governor cried out, Anamathala was a traitor, sprang upon him as he was speaking, seized him by the throat, and put him out of the council. Then, she adds, the governor stood on the platform and spoke to the Indians. He told them that Anamathala should no longer be the chief, for he tried to keep the Indians from keeping their promise. Following his humiliation, Brevard assured her young readers Anamathala never recovered from his mortification at the treatment he had received. So, this account concludes cheerily. The Tallahassee passed away from their old fields, leaving only the musical names of their dwelling places to tell of their long possession of the land. Duval's courageous visit is the title given to this account of the assault on the Seminole leader. As you can imagine, dear listener, the actual story is a little more complicated than this. So it's not just this Governor Duval showed up and like, you're not keeping your word. You're supposed to give Tallahassee to us.
Yeah, right. And that creates some of the later stories that end up informing such smears as the term Indian giving and things like that.
Right.
But also, Governor Duval was a gifted self-publicist, and his tales were too good not to be plagiarized. So, what's that? Is that a trumpet sounding? That's Washington Irving appears on the Florida literary scene once again to misrepresent the tragic events unfolding there. In his latest Florida fiction, Irving took Governor Duval's conspiracy to dispossess Anamathala and the others and turned it into a parable of American virtue and generosity. In The Conspiracy of Namathala, the first thing Irving does to trivialize Anamathala and his people is to rob them of their connection to the U.S. and so the reader of any understanding of who they were and why they reacted as they did to the imposition of U.S. rule. In this telling, these people aren't refugees from the United States. They are the degenerate descendants of the Aboriginal Floridians, in reality extinct for generations. From the time of the chimerical cruisings of old Ponce de Leon in search of the Fountain of Youth, right up to the present day, Washington Irving declares these Seminoles had been roaming around Florida, causing nothing but trouble. He goes on to transform Anamathala, the man of peace, into a deceitful man of violence. Simultaneously, Duval is changed from trickster into philanthropic idealist, eager to establish schools so that the Seminoles' children should be instructed like the children of white men. Instead of welcoming Duval's kindly efforts, Irving had the Seminoles, who had begged for a teacher at Moultrie Creek, spurning Duval's kindly offer. To know how to read and write is very good for the white man, but very bad for red men. He has one of the fictional Seminoles warn the governor, it makes white men better, but red men worse.
Oh, God! Oh!
Jeez.
It's so hold on. So I gotta take a second here to just rein something into, because, you know, as is often the case with Florida stories and has been the case throughout this whole series of ours, the geography can get a little mixed up and confusing. And I must confess now, dear listener, I truly thought everything that was said before about Anamathala and those two prospectors saying, oh, we're going to take this place, I thought that was about Jacksonville. That was about Tallahassee. So if I misspoke earlier, I apologize. This is basically everything we've been saying so far about this specific bit of stolen land and Governor Duval's role in taking it, and Anamathala, you know, hanging out with these dudes, playing ball with them.
Yeah, it's to take everything east of the line, just as Jefferson said, to push everyone out west past some line that they now decided.
And so the thrust of this chapter that I want to sort of close out with has to do with just, I mean, what a historically corrupt and crooked city Tallahassee is politically, and I think that's fairly well known in American politics. And Governor Duval is, I think, kind of the core of that whole system being built. And there's
the first long-lasting governor of Florida who actually has some sort of legacy.
Let me read this chapter. So Duval was the linchpin of this anti-democratic as well as race-based system of patronage, privilege, corruption, and repression. As Emerson put it in an apt and homey phrase, Governor Duval is the button on which all things are hung. Others, when it came to metaphors, preferred nipples. We have all been here like a litter of hungry, suckling pigs, observed one of Tallahassee's noon nabobs, squalling and rooting each other from the teats. Wow. Thanks to stolen land and stolen labor, but thanks most of all to the U.S. government, people like Duval, himself, James Gadsden, Colonel Clinch, for a time grew rich. Once rich, they imagined themselves to be blue-blooded as well. I thought that was a very good little passage about what's being built here, essentially. So I think we're ready to move to the next chapter soon.
Right, yeah. So a lot of those myths are created by Irving. But yeah, we are going to breeze through, I think, a lot of this chapter. There is Lafayette in this chapter.
That's what I was just looking at here, too, yeah.
Yeah, who is known by an incredibly long name. Before, his name was Marie Joseph Paul Yves Roche Gilbert Dumontier. Americans know him better by the name Lafayette. In honor of his services from the War of Independence, Congress authorized him to take possession of an entire township as a tract of that magnitude is called anywhere in the United States. Florida's future governor, Richard Keith Call, and he's going to come up later in chapter 10. Yeah. Then he persuades eminent French friend of America to take his township at Tallahassee, where a Gallic version of the usual Florida failure unfolded. And so Lafayette actually loathes slavery, and he later says by the time he dies in 1834, America has embittered him, and he says, I would have never drawn my sword in the cause of America if I could have conceived thereby I was founding a land of slavery.
Damn, it's crazy. That quote does make it into the history books.
Yeah,
it's crazy
right?
They don't teach us that one.
Yeah, they don't put that on Lafayette Square.
I don't hear about that one. Yeah, that's so weird. Crazy.
Yeah, so...
I'm sure they love America over there. That's why they gave us that big-ass statue. That's
he got to own Tallahassee, I think, for a long time. I don't ultimately remember how he lost possession of it.
I know, I'm trying to remember that right now, too. Point. He definitely does. That's mentioned in here, is that he sells it.
We could talk about Gad Humphries' role, because I think that's where he ends up having his opinion sort of start to shift.
Yeah.
So Gad Humphries, fresh from tricking Ennimothla out of his land at Tallahassee, was one of the first to turn the Spanish land grant provision into a self-enrichment scheme. This time, the real estate he coveted was a 20,000-acre domain located near present-day Ocala. Humphries did not buy his acreage. Instead, he contrived to get himself named the co-legatee of one of the King of Spain's land grant.
Hold on, are we talking about some free real estate?
Yeah, that sounds a lot like some free real estate.
We're talking about free real estate right now.
Yeah, and later there's going to be the story of Clinch getting even more free real estate in chapter 10.
Dude, hell yeah. Good for him.
Oh, and then here it says, hang on, I want to get this whole story.
Okay.
It's the treaty with Spain specified that all grants made after January 1818 were null and void, but that did not stop Gad Humphries and others like him. With the help of shrewd lawyers and compliant judges, they used Spanish land grants, or more often, alleged copies and unauthenticated translations of them, to acquire millions of acres of Florida land. Thanks to this early form of judicial activism, billions of dollars in Florida real estate today still belong to wealthy individuals and powerful corporations that the Spanish crown originally granted to entirely different persons for entirely different purposes, before Florida became a U.S. possession. So, yeah, that shows even more of the real estate scheming and things like that. And speaking of judicial activism, that's, of course, becoming even more relevant today as the Supreme Court and other courts are working quickly to dismantle the Civil Rights Act, essentially, after the recent ruling by both the Supreme Court and also by a state. I think it's Kentucky or one of the states.
Oh, another part of this chapter that we almost missed that I am really glad I'm seeing here now too is that in 1828, the year Jackson won the presidency, Gad Humphries got into an administrative battle with Governor Duval because someone named Margaret Cook requested that her slave be restored to her, and no one could find this slave, and it basically became something where Governor Duval was having to, it's sort of like the free the hostages sort of thing, where it was like, yes, there probably was someone named Jack or John, but at some point it became more about just using it as this cudgel against the Seminole as a reason to essentially starve them. Right? So it's like...
to impose a punishment on them like a mobster does, that they don't just lend you the money for fun or because you need it. They're trying to get you on the hook, and so they want you to fall behind on your payments so that you have to pay more interest and things like that. That's how mobsters work, and that incidentally was also how early Americans worked in their negotiations with Native Americans.
And this is where you end up with Gad Humphries literally begging Governor Duval to give the Seminoles some food because it's becoming so dire that it's just not a good idea to be treating these people this way.
Yeah, and he begs on account of their humanity at some point, which is very new.
And again, as we said earlier, not a good guy, right? He's not this a bad guy we're talking about, but he just has enough self-preservation to understand that, like, we're essentially building this powder keg here. And one of the things that Allman notes in the text is that despite being at the center of the lead up to the Second Seminole War, quote unquote, this Gad Humphries guy is really, gone from the history textbooks.
Yeah, he's erased.
Despite owning a lot of Ocala, too,
Even though, like I said, he could be the inspiration for those types of stories that you have, like Dances with Wolves, or like Pocahontas, the idea of this so-called Indian agent having a change of heart ends up being a very common story that we tell over and over again. Also, the movie Avatar.
Right. Well, let me read this quick paragraph here. Denounced by Duval, Gadsden, Clinch, and many others, Humphries tried to explain himself to the new administration in Washington. That I have questioned the policy and even doubted the justice of some of the property controversies between the whites and Indians, I am free to admit, he conceded, as Jumper, one of the Seminole leaders with whom Humphries held periodic philosophical discussions, had tried to make him understand U.S. legal proceedings were not about justice, at least when non-whites were involved. The laws of the whites, the Seminole leader reminded him at one point, were made solely for their own benefit.
Yeah.
So now Humphries is forced from office and scorned as basically a traitor to his country and race. So,
right.
There you go.
And so
that's,
it says,
what you get.
Yeah, another paragraph here. It says, Humphries' transformation begins with his appointment as Indian agent. It seems he had been handed the keys to a kingdom, but Humphries has the capacity for human empathy, and that proves to be his undoing. Where once Florida seemed the blank canvas of his avarice, he comes to see human beings who are hungry, who have been cheated, who deserve better because they are human beings, just like him. The decor may be Washington Irving. The denouement is Joseph Conrad. Only a few years after he uses his government position to take from the Seminoles everything he can, Colonel Humphries finds himself pleading fruitlessly for an act of humanity on their behalf, a lot like Schindler's List, too, really. In official correspondence concerning Indians and blacks, Gad Humphries actually calls for justice. Mm-hmm. Like DeSoto, Humphries never fully comprehends how lost he was.
Yeah.
The official surveyors, as the law requires, survey his royal grant. Rather than accept possession of the 20,000 acres the government says is his, Humphries decides to settle for nothing less than 20,000 acres of his dreams. He sues the government of Florida. When his case is finally heard, he learns firsthand what Jumper told him. Now that Humphries is no longer a powerful public official, the judge rebuffs him. Undeterred, he pursues his claim all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. It again gets him nothing except new enemies. Humphries' new judicial ruination takes decades. His financial ruination unfolds much more quickly. Desperate for money, he rents out his slaves. The sweat of their brows doesn't satisfy his creditors. The court,
again, not a good guy.
Yeah, the court orders his slaves to be sold to the highest bidder at auction, which is an embarrassment for him. And so he basically
let me cover a passage that summarizes it, because basically Gad Humphries is ruined, and it's this is again we're trying to breeze through this because we're not going to tell you a story in this episode that you haven't heard some version of already, and we're getting into the part of like Florida history where it's all this like spiraling repetition of the same stories over and over again of people seeing dollar signs in front of their eyes and then realizing that that's not to be had there, and actually you're now ruined. Gad Humphries pioneered the paradigm of American failure in Florida. Sooner or later, almost all of them would wound up like him. Murat, Duval, Gaines, and scores of others like them, or who wanted to be like them. Florida ruined them all, turning even the mightiest and best connected into wandering exiles seeking to recoup their losses someplace else. Governor Duval, after losing everything in Florida, wound up a lawyer of middling esteem in Texas. After going broke, Prince Murat tried to recoup his fortunes by joining the Belgian Foreign Legion. He failed again. His widow, George Washington's grandniece, was saved from financial embarrassment only by subvention from her dead husband's first cousin, future Emperor Napoleon III. And Prince Murat's a character from Fayetteville, but I highlighted another sentence that I mentioned earlier that I want to read it just to close out this section.
Yeah, I think it's worth reading all the way to the end of this chapter if you don't want.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, we can do that. You're right, because that last page.
Yeah, it's like a paragraph.
Yeah, I'll read that. So, why did they fail? Racism was the original sin of these Americans, but it was the fusion of racism with the conquistadors' mortal sin, greed, that doomed their Florida ambitions. By the time Humphries was dismissed from his post, the most striking feature of his life in Florida was how easily the imposition of the new white supremacist oligarchic system of U.S. rule had gone. It wasn't a pretty picture, but the situation might conceivably have remained stable were it not for a destabilizing monomania that went beyond avarice and racism. The problem was that Americans could not be satisfied with most of everything or the best of everything. They wanted everything. Even when taking everything destroyed whole peoples along with, as we would know today, ecosystems and other species. This monomania made them seem both crazy and evil to the Seminoles. It blinded, and I would argue they were correct. It blinded most Americans to the meanings and consequences of their actions, but it did not blind Humphries. He had come to understand that the greatest danger in Florida was not unruly Seminoles or runaway blacks, but the danger Americans posed to themselves. He understood that Jumper got it right in the course of one of their discussions when he told him, "It seems that white people will not rest nor suffer us do so till they have got all the property belonging to us." So that essentially is what we were talking about, that like madness that is consuming these new, which the Spanish definitely had, as they mention here too, but they had just come to the conclusion already that there's really not any money to be made here. And now you have this whole new second, even crazier, even more violent, sort of, even more racist group of colonizers essentially moving in. So I'm going to hand it off to you for Chapter 10 if you want to tackle it.
Yeah, we're moving on to Chapter 10, Defined by Massacre, and we're going to try to move through this one quick to finish out this episode. So you had the Gadsden Treaty, which was forced emigration, and it said the Seminole Indians relinquished to the United States all claim to the lands they at present occupy in the territory of Florida. This treaty announced and agreed to emigrate to the country assigned to the Creeks west of the Mississippi River. Once there, the Seminoles would cease to exist, or as Gadsden phrased it, the people expelled from Florida will be received as a constituent part of the Creek Nation. All money due to the Seminoles, this new piece of paper had announced, would be taken away from them and added to Creek annuities. So the objective of this was genocide, as it would be later defined by the U.S. government during the Nuremberg trials, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. For white-skinned Floridians, it was the best of both worlds. Once deprived of their identity, dark-skinned Seminoles could be enslaved, while those with Indian features were driven west beyond the Mississippi. So that's as I said, the tripod of injustice that needs to be set up in order to maintain this oligarchic rule that's establishing itself in America. And one of those legs of the injustice is, of course, the poor white people as well, who get nothing in exchange for this except the satiation of their racism.
And free real estate.
Yeah. Well, no, the free real estate goes to...
Some of them.
The free real estate goes to the very small cabal at the top.
You're right.
And
then they sell the real estate to the poor
and rent.
whites. Yeah,
they rent to that middle class.
Yep.
And so they're still getting fucked, but they happen to be happy because they're at least seeing that at least black people aren't getting a public education as well. They're also getting starved of a public education system or public transportation system.
But they're doing it honestly.
But they're doing it
whitely.
Yeah, they're doing it whitely.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, so 10
Florida
years.
excellence.
Yeah, right. So 10 years after Gadsden had managed to prod only 7 chiefs to sign his treaty at Moultrie Creek, and the press had been barred from this, which is very similar to today and how they pushed out all of the non-Fox News and Newsmax related press from the White House.
Yeah. Well, it's as I said at the top, too. They're very aware that there's a historical record and we're now a part of it.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
It's not, there's a very self-conscious performance going on for that. And they understand that everything they're doing at this point as a part of the process of bringing Florida into the United States is pretty ugly and not something they want to be a part of the historical record if they can avoid it. So they go to great lengths to avoid that.
Right. Though the press was barred, Florida newspapers discovered that the translators had been bribed to give the Seminoles a false idea of the proposals he was inflicting on them. Even so, at their insistence, a proviso was added to this treaty stipulating that before it could go into effect, the 7 confidential chiefs should be sent at the expense of the U.S. as early as convenient to examine the country assigned to the creeks west of the Mississippi River. Only when and if they were satisfied with the character of that country and of the favorable disposition of the creeks would the agreement herein stipulated be binding on the respective parties. As Captain Sprague would later observe, the fulfillment of the treaty was clearly conditional. And so they actually said that these chiefs would have to approve the new land before they were forced to live on it. And they actually, of course, now in retrospect, we realize they're not going to do that. And so they don't actually take into consideration the Native Americans in any way, whether or not they like this new land. They just force them off of the land. They ram this treaty through. And now there's a new Indian agent named John Fagan, who is a major whom President Jackson had named the new Indian agent.
Well, I'm glad we established Gad Humphries was a bad guy, even though he kind of came around a little bit, because it seems like John Fagan is like a really bad guy.
Yeah, he's
John
a really
Fagan
bad guy. No coming around story
guy.
with this guy.
Yeah, right, exactly. John Fagan's just a avaricious piece of shit. And I don't know if we'll get to it too, but there was, keep going.
All right, Fagan personifies the Jackson spoil system at its worst, as Captain Sprague later says. Without the requisite qualifications for the office, he brought with him the patronage of the executive as well as the partialities of the people. The new Indian agent, he added, was totally unqualified, both by education and morals. On their journey to what today is Oklahoma, Fagin and the confidential chiefs first traveled by ship across the Gulf of Mexico to New Orleans. Boarding riverboats, they made their way up the Mississippi and Arkansas rivers to Little Rock, and from there, they traveled by horseback to Oklahoma. The Seminoles were horrified by what they found. "We saw Indians bringing scalps to the garrison," one of them later testified. The same Creeks who executed the massacre at Fort Negro also helped ravage Seminole settlements during General, now President Jackson's invasion of Florida, were now masters of the land where the Seminoles were supposed to be moved.
So that's something I read before too. That's like, I wanted to just sort of elaborate on a little bit. They did bring several of the Seminole chiefs to the Oklahoma area where they were planning to move all of them. There's actually parts of Oklahoma called Seminole, and to this day.
And they were horrified by it because the Creeks were violent against them.
Right. Like, this is what what I was saying at the front about how these are not monolithic groups ever. The Seminole are kind of unique in the indigenous world of this time, but unique's not always good, and they did not always get along with the Creek. Apparently, I think there were other allusions to that in the story, but the Creek are already here, and the Creek are not excited about the prospect of the Seminole being moved in. Obviously, the Seminole are nervous about it too, and it's just generally a very different place than where they're used to living. So they don't approve.
Right. Now, the new Indian agent Fagin ends up manufacturing a new treaty, which he calls the Treaty of Fort Gibson, after the outpost in the Arkansas Territory where the Seminole group stopped before resuming the journey home to Florida. The delay supposedly gave them more time to examine the country, but the reality was that they were detained there because Fort Gibson had become the nexus of a conspiracy stretching from Oklahoma wilderness to Washington. Both Jackson and Fagin were among the co-conspirators, and their tactics, according to the modern research, included coercion, bribery, altercation of the treaty after the fact, and at Fagin's secret request, Jackson had ordered 3 U.S. commissioners to rush to Fort Gibson in order to intercept the chiefs before they could return to Florida. So constant conniving and
backstabbing.
The things that you would get the term Indian giving from, actually just totally the behavior of Jackson and his associates, clearly.
In reading this book, I always felt like it was like reading the backstory of why the Confederacy and the founding of the United States are always, like, when you get into like a leftist circles especially, talked about in such hushed tones. And I had never understood quite, and it seems obvious in hindsight, that Florida is the nexus of all of these forces. But these stories in particular, I think, really, because we're only 30 years away from the Civil War. Remember, it's like we're in a very foundational time in the United States of deciding what kind of country is this going to be.
Yeah, so just like Humphreys, Fagin had intended to profit from the Seminoles' misfortune, and the Seminoles claimed an article he inserted into the Fort Gibson document have expressed high confidence in the friendship and ability of their present agent, Major Fagin, and desire that he may be permitted to remove them to their new homes. Removing the Seminoles would be a major logistics operation involving many lucrative contracts, but Fagin's self-enrichment scheme came to an end when investigators discovered that he had been overcharging his government and then, after involving the subcontractors in his fraudulent schemes, not paying them at all.
Classic move.
So very similar to the deportation process going on today, and also the level of, we'll say, entrepreneurship that also conducted the Holocaust in Nazi Germany and across Europe. That these sort of self-starters who saw a profit motive were driven to conduct the act of ethnic cleansing and didn't really see anything wrong with it as they started these quote-unquote businesses to do this sort of thing.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, so...
he's also in debt to the Seminole Interpreter. Great bit of color there, too. Yeah. Color detail. Just...
Right.
This guy, remember, it's like, Gad Humphries was a bad guy. Gad Humphries seems like he was kind of like a saint compared to this guy. This guy just seems like
this guy was scandalous that he was in debt when he took this position. Right. And a later myth was that criminals like Fagin were doing something normal, but that was not the case. Fagin, Mathews, this kind of conniving that was going on was not entirely normal for the time. It created scandals, as we said earlier in the episode, across the country. So the Treaty of Payne's Landing, like the Fort Negro Massacre, aroused a storm of condemnation, shame, and foreboding that only later was excised from accounts of what happened. A foul blot upon the escutcheon of the nation, thundered Thomas L. McKenney, a former superintendent of Indian Affairs. The evidences of fraud and improper conduct on the part of Major Fagin added to that disgrace. So Humphreys had come to understand that the U.S.'s abuse of the Seminoles was going to provoke an explosion. So now, too, the person who, along with Gadsden, had done the most to make violence in Florida inevitable. In late 1833, William Pope Duval resigned as the governor of Florida, and during his 12 years in office, he had turned a territory at peace into a swamp of injustice, ethnic hatred, and smoldering violence. He did not intend to be the one in charge when the chickens came home to roost. His successor...
Very classic Southern politician.
Very classic.
Very good.
Don't want to be caught holding the bag.
Always get out before you're holding the bag. That's, just a rule for anyone.
So then he's succeeded by John H. Eaton, and Eaton already held a number of distinguished positions before, and his chief qualification for all of them was that Andrew Jackson liked him. And so he was part of the Jacksonian spoils system, and he was appointed to the U.S. Senate in a violation to the Constitution at age 28, and then he had been promoted to the Secretary of War once Jackson had become president. So soon after that, his Wonder Boy had become embroiled in one of Washington's first sex scandals, the Petticoat Affair. Yeah, so that was Eaton involved in that. And then
I can't remember what happens in the Petticoat Affair. What the is the Petticoat Affair about?
That was one of the
it's so quaint.
Jackson affairs. It's quaint by today's standards. Yeah, it was like basically one of the first sex scandals that ever happened in the U.S. under Jackson. Let's see if we can find a quick summary of that. It was known as the Eaton Affair, too. It was a political scandal involving members of Jackson's cabinet and their wives, led by Florida Calhoun, wife John C. Calhoun. Dubbed the Petticoats, they were socially ostracized, Secretary of War John Eaton was socially ostracized over disapproval of the circumstances surrounding the Eatons' marriages and what they deemed her failure to meet the moral standards of a cabinet's wife.
Oh my God, that's right. It was something like she was just widow who... She was like a popular widow or something, and it was, something incredibly
his wife
quaint
was
and
like
stupid.
Frequenting a bar or some bullshit. And even that was at the time considered
like she ran
to
a bar or something like that. Like I think she ran a bar. Yeah, I think that's what it was. I think she ran. Oh my God, dude! And then at the same time, these people are murdering people for being of a different race and ethnicity, and reimposing slavery. And they're like, well, it's like that's scary. That's,
but Governor did have a sharp nose for political danger, and he did know it was a lie when Fagin and Jackson had claimed that the Seminoles agreed to be deported. I pray you, he asked, does not this circumstance raise a doubt whether the treaty can be considered valid and binding? No one listened, and so this time he got himself appointed Minister Plenipotentiary to Spain. And the Indian question of removal is one that should be managed with great caution and care. Tread then cautiously, Eaton had warned, as he deftly fled the scene of the expanding disaster, once again to assume another exalted, appointed post in another exotic location.
This really speaks to what you were saying at the top of the show, too, about how this is all just one continuous conflict of indigenous genocide.
Yeah.
And I think you see a similar phenomenon with all of the U.S.'s wars in the Middle East, too, where it's like by making these conflicts discrete in narrative, you're able to hide your greater ambitions as a nation.
Right.
As a like imperial project, really. So that is what is happening right here, and it's where the U.S. is sort of like developing these muscles and instincts with the first and second Seminole Wars, where after the first Seminole War, you have this guy, Eaton, who dared to marry a bar wench, right, who was of low moral standing, looking at this freak Fagin and Jackson, the bullet-riddled, like, genocidal lunatic.
And he's like, I think you might get in trouble for that.
They're there, just looking at the globe, like, yes, Florida will be ours. They're like two evil wizards or something, and they're like, the Seminole have agreed to leave, and then we'll be. And Eaton is the other one in the room who's like, I think this will go poorly. And remember,
it's like maybe the
all
one
bad guys, but it's shades of bad guys.
It's like the Thomas Massey who's recognizing I think this Epstein might actually become a bigger scandal.
Right, exactly. He's the Thomas Massey of the era, taking a firm anti-Epstein position, being like, look, this whole mass ethnic relocation you guys are scheming on, I think this is going to get pretty ugly. I don't really want to be a part of this.
I'm out.
It's like,
thanks for sending me to another exotic location, Jackson.
You're right. Is he a good guy? No. Was he the better guy in the room at that time? Absolutely. Because, they were on some monster shit.
So enter another Indian agent. This one is named...
What happened with Fagin? I was trying to find that. Where
Fagin,
did
I think, is still operating. I'm pretty sure there's more than one Indian agent. Right. So here comes a new Florida's latest Indian agent named General Wiley S. Thompson. And he says, you solemnly bound to remove yourselves. And so he said...
You said you would move off of your ancestral homeland. You asshole.
You know you were not forced to do it, he added, when they stated that they had been coerced.
Yeah.
Thompson's earnest obliviousness, as much as the lies themselves, provoked sneering contempt. General Thompson, when communicating to the chiefs, one American remembered, was repeatedly interrupted by groans, violent grimaces, and language of the most abusive kind, expressed in an undertone, almost like a Republican town hall nowadays.
I love it. Yeah.
So
that's cool energy. Just a bunch of Seminoles being like, oh, just being pissed and tired of this shit.
Yeah.
I mean, it's sad that,
right. And as we say, the cycle repeats over and over. So basically, Thompson speed runs in a period of 25 months what had taken 30 years. He speed runs the path of Jeffersonian talk and then moving into Jacksonian brutality, and finds basically that the tactic of Jeffersonian sweet talking doesn't work. He just needs to resort to the violence. So you have basically yet another quick repetition of that cycle playing out.
Well, there's a quick passage I want to read here too, just a short one, but I think it's relevant because this will come up with the story of Osceola when we get to that. So, nothing so well epitomized the compartmentalization of American racism as the contrasting attitude towards blacks having guns and Indians having them.
Yeah.
Blacks with guns were the key element in the nightmare of a slave revolt. Provided they were friendly, Indians were another matter. As Thompson saw it, by making the Seminoles leave Florida, he was helping them set off on a manly adventure.
Right.
On that adventure, they would need weapons and ammunition. So when one young man seemed particularly hostile to Thompson's attempt at persuasion, the Indian agent sought to win his friendship by giving him a rifle.
Hey, it's almost like Trump wanted a Second Amendment solution to Iran.
Hillary wants to essentially abolish the Second Amendment. By the way, and if she gets to pick her judges, nothing you can do, folks. Although the Second Amendment people, maybe there is, I don't know.
Yeah, hey, you know what, Mr. Native American person? I believe in your Second Amendment rights. Here you go. In some version, the weapon is a silver-encrusted masterpiece of the gunsmith's art imported all the way from Savannah. Whatever the details, and from here onward, the mythic embellishment gets thicker and thicker. We know that Thompson did give such a present. We also know the name of the recipient, which was William Powell Jr., who only later would become known as Osceola, along with Tecumseh, Cochise, and Geronimo, one of America's most famous, quote-unquote, Indian leaders. I didn't realize that passage was actually exactly about the thing I was thinking of, but I wanted to make sure that scene is in there of this man respecting William Powell Jr.'s Second Amendment rights and saying, hey, you know what? Go west, young man. Here's a gun. Here's your gun. Go west. Go kill some other indigenous people and get your free real estate. And that's how this all works. You got it? So,
yeah.
That's essentially the scene there.
Right.
So, I don't know. You get back to it.
Yeah, here enters the figure of Osceola, or William Powell. And here's a quote. It said, "No one better personified the outraged sense of injustice which American aggression provoked than young Powell. American self-serving moralistic piety, in turn, found precise representation in the personage of Wiley Thompson. What is striking about their encounter is the intimacy. They elicited in each other, by turns, curiosity, amity, forthrightness, disagreement, scorn, disappointment, anger, vengefulness, and rage. At Fort King, near present-day Ocala, on the fringe of the concentration zone, the lives of these two men intertwined. In the dynamics of their intensely personal interrelationship, a centuries-long history of interracial relations, beginning in wary friendship and enduring in undying enmity, acted itself out in a matter of months."
Yeah, this next paragraph's good, too.
Yeah, if you want to read that one, you can.
Abundant first-hand accounts document that the Seminoles, even after losing almost everything at Moultrie Creek, still wanted to live in peace. All their talks, petitions, remonstrances, letters breathe only the wish for peace and fair dealing, Andrew Jackson's own biographer conceded. Had the Americans been willing to leave the Seminoles in possession of the wastes of Central Florida, which they themselves had allotted to them, great misfortune might have been averted on both sides. Instead, in Parton's words, the Seminoles were drawn at last into a collision with the United States by a chain of circumstances with which they had little to do, and the responsibility of which belongs not to them. So, yeah, the Seminole Nation itself is just such an interesting entity at this point in history, because it's somewhat nebulous, but to the extent that it is nebulous, it is concentrated in Florida, and very specifically an amalgamation of not just the indigenous peoples, but all of the other types of people who have found themselves living in Florida and not really having a place anywhere else in the rest of the certainly northern United States. So that's kind of what is the core of it. It's just the Southern American Spanish-speaking indigenous peoples who have found a way to live in Florida that works for them, which is not an easy thing. Remember, it's very difficult at this time, and have decided, you know what, this is where I'm from. And I mean, we need to get more color in that area, but keep it going.
So then Powell visits Thompson, and it reaches a breaking point, and Thompson later complains that the young man came to his office and insulted him by some insolent remarks. This was not the first time he acted disrespectfully, but on these occasions he apologized, and I forgave. Now it happened again. So on this occasion, Thompson explained, I confined him in irons. The next day, Thompson added emotional duress to physical humiliation. When Powell begged that I release him, he recounted, I informed him that without satisfactory security that he would behave better and prove faithful in the future, he must remain in confinement. The best way to prove that he had repented, Thompson informed him, was to provide acknowledgement of the validity of the treaty and then persuade all his friends and neighbors to accept their deportation. So, Then he goes on to believe that Osceola, at the time Powell, is going to go back to his friends and tell them to accept the offer. And as he calls it, that he's going to be a sincere turncoat.
Wow.
And so the Indian agent writes, true to his word, he this day appeared with 79 of his people, men, women, and children, and redeemed his promise. I now have no doubt as to his sincerity. Giving his erstwhile prisoner an extra supply of gunpowder, Thompson, again, arming him because he thinks he's on his side now.
Just an American story.
Yeah, Thompson wishes Osceola Godspeed as he heads out once again into the Florida wilderness. His confidence was still unshaken on the afternoon of December 28, 1835, when Billy Powell killed General Wiley Thompson, his former mentor and also tormentor. So the day that actually Powell goes and kills this Indian agent, he still trusts that he's going to be a cooperator in his conspiracy to dispossess the Seminoles. So Billy Powell had been going along with him and then ultimately kills him. And it says, as the U.S. Indian agent smoked a cigar, Osceola and more than a dozen others opened fire. 24 bullets riddled his body, killing him instantly. Thompson's scalp was sliced with many small pieces so that each member of the attack party might have proof in his role in ridding their people of the person who had come to personify all the evils and injustices inflicted on them. Their resentments had been festering for a long time. As Captain Sprague later acknowledged, all that was wanting was a heart bold enough to strike the first blow. And thanks to Osceola, that blow had now been struck.
So, but just pause for a second here, too. I want to just, again, give the listeners some context to, me as a Floridian, which I've since learned that a lot of schools do teach this sort of story. God knows how exactly, but, Osceola is a known historical figure to a lot of, Floridian kids in public school, just because he's kind of, hard to avoid.
Even at the time, he became known because of how interesting his situation is.
And it
actually talks about that.
Fascinating, truly.
He was sort of a well-known spectacle, a fascinating spectacle in American media at the time. Just the fact that he existed.
Yeah, he's a very interesting person. And the thing I was getting to is that, I read this story for the first time when reading this book. And I don't know if it's coming through quite exactly what is happening here. But the long and short of it is that Osceola is, arguing with this guy, essentially. Because we'll probably reiterate this in the text, but Osceola is a guy who, like you said, he's also known as Billy Powell. I believe he's from a family of fur traders.
Yeah, we can get into his profile Scottish. Now if you want.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. It's he's essentially someone who straddles the line between whiteness and indigenous identity and has the knowledge and linguistic skills to sort of operate on both sides of that. And the thing is, that's not even terribly unique for this region. There's plenty of guys like that. I think Osceola was just a sort of uniquely charismatic guy who developed this particular relationship with, what's-his-face, the guy who just got killed, Thompson. And the essential narrative that's happening here is that, Thompson gives him this gun, it's go west, young man. And he's like, you. He shows up and he's arguing with him. And it becomes so heated that Thompson imprisons him, which obviously, scary. And Billy Powell is trying to convince him to, let him free. Osceola is. And eventually, in the course of arguing for his freedom, Thompson tells him, if you want to be free, go back to your people and tell them that the treaty is valid and they should also self-support themselves, right? And so he lets him loose under that pretext. He comes back with some people, and the guy's like, wow. Thompson is so self-deluded, Wiley Thompson, about the righteousness of what they're doing, that he just believes all the way through.
And he doesn't expect that this could be an attack on him.
Yeah, and you got to understand, too, that, him and Osceola have probably spent hours intellectually debating in the marketplace of ideas about the
in
validity
jail cell
of
debates
the indigenous people as human rights. To be a fly on the wall in those discussions, honestly, like it's fascinating to think about. But reality is, at this point,
so the killing of Thompson sparks basically the outbreak of the Second Seminole War, as it would be called, because this incites a large slave revolt, really, which Allman says in this chapter, part of the American self-conceptualization is to argue that there was never any large race riots or any large uprisings. And so it calls this the Second Seminole War, but it really was this emergence of, it was probably the biggest slave uprising or an insurgent uprising within America, and led to massive casualties that often are underplayed to this day.
Yeah. I mean, if I can read a quick section here.
Yeah.
The attack on Thompson was part of a coordinated offensive. Between Christmas and New Year's Eve in 1835, a broad-based alliance of Seminoles and blacks, including people of whites as well as other racial origins, inflicted one of the most terrible defeats ever suffered by the U.S. Army at the hands of the Native peoples. A U.S. Senate report later stated it wasn't just Native peoples. The uprising showed that the two biggest problems of American expansion, dispossessing Indians and enslaving blacks, were intertwined conditions produced by the advance of American nationalism. Duncan Clinch, by now promoted to general, recognized the multi-ethnic nature of the resistance when he referred to the attackers as a combination of Indians, Negroes, and the Negroes on the plantations. Once again, there had been a failure of U.S. intelligence. At the very moment, General Thompson imagined Powell was persuading the Seminoles to accept deportation. They had been organizing a war of resistance. The most striking feature of these attacks was the coordination. The Seminoles had in what today's counterinsurgency parlance is called an integrated command structure. And, as I'm reading this, I would actually love to know more about the relationship between the Seminole Wars and the Haitian Revolution, because it would not shock me to find out that there are characters who find their way into both stories. And I bet that's a very obscure and easily lost little corner of history. Yeah. But you see the parallels. And it's like obviously just the nature of oppression, but I don't know.
On that note, I did find this to be an interesting recommendation. I haven't read it myself, but Allman says that this book by Cantor Brown, Florida's Peace River Frontier, was in 1991, was the very first time that someone had presented a scholarly breakdown of the Seminoles' strategy, I guess, military strategy, that integrated command structure. So if anybody's interested in how the Seminoles actually coordinated this, I guess, decentralized attack that was very powerful against the U.S., it seems that even as late as 1991, we were still making discoveries about that. So I found that to be an interesting recommendation. But yeah, as we said, Billy Powell or Osceola became really a fascination in the minds of Americans, even in his own time period. People wanted to know who was this exotic, quote-unquote, Indian chief. So we're getting now to the profile of Billy Powell. Billy Powell, the now infamous Osceola, was born on U.S. territory near present-day Tuskegee, Alabama, in 1804. His father was a white man named William Powell. His mother, Polly Copinger, was also of European descent. Her mother was named Anne McQueen. Osceola's great-grandfather was a Scotsman named James McQueen, who founded a frontier dynasty. If all that mattered was descent from original settlers, Billy Powell would have qualified as an American aristocrat. But James McQueen not only traded with the Indians, he intermarried with them. Around the time the future Osceola was born, the U.S. Indian agent in the area described the clan in a letter sent to President Jefferson. Peter McQueen, a half-breed, he wrote, referring to Osceola's uncle, is a snug trader, has valuable property in Negroes and stock, and begins to know their value. There was no place for such half-breeds in the new Alabama. Jackson and his followers were creating through wholesale dispossession of the Indian savages.
Right.
Followed by the mass...
This is Osceola's father, right?
Yeah, Osceola's father was William.
Right.
James McQueen was, I think, his uncle or his great-grandfather, actually, who was this Scotsman who owned a frontier dynasty, but intermarried with the native people.
Right.
And so as part of the formation of the U.S., these people were disenfranchised and really erased from history. People like this who were also legal landowners, but the system actually did care about what your race was and whether you were mixed race. So ultimately, James McQueen found in the emerging American society that he basically had no purchase, even though he had land, and was pushed off and ultimately dispossessed. And that's where Billy Powell ends up becoming intermixed in this situation where Jackson is driving people off of their land, what now is known as the Trail of Tears. Billy Powell and his family are some of the landed aristocrats who are being pushed off of the land. And that really is what makes Billy Powell's identity situated in this struggle that we now call, or even the identity that we now call the Seminole people.
So, am I hearing you correctly, too? I guess I didn't quite understand this when I read it, but Billy Powell's family were Scottish slaveholders who were also dispossessed during the Trail of Tears.
Yes. And so he had every reason.
So weird.
Yeah.
Right? Talk about
he had money and
like
power and had every reason to want to organize some sort of rebellion against this force that's pushing him off his land, and that says, as Allman says, there is no place for half-breeds in American aristocracy. So they're just driving him off his land.
Right, exactly. You committed the mortal sin of breaking from whiteness in any way, and therefore
his ancestors
you're now
intermixed.
Removed of humanity.
Yeah, that really was his mortal sin. His ancestors intermixed, and Allman talks about in this chapter how if things had gone differently, if we had a different understanding of our American identity, we would see Osceola as deeply American in his identity, in his love of freedom, in his hatred for injustice, that we recognize these things as American values when they're white people fighting for it. When it's Thomas Jefferson who holds those beliefs, we say those are the founding fathers, but Osceola
espouses them, right?
Yeah.
When he says those things. When Osceola lives those things, everyone gets all upset. And then the they do to Osceola is absolutely heinous, and we will get to that. But yeah, I mean, it's heartbreaking what you're saying. I absolutely, it truly brings a tear to the eye, because you're right that, like, not to be like the most dorky millennial ever, but it's like, it's amazing this hasn't ever been a prestige TV show, the story of Osceola and Wiley Thompson. Because
hasn't been turned into a Netflix show yet.
Right, and it's insanely
it fulfills
compelling.
A lot
it's
of our sentiments.
Compelling.
Yeah, even in this society, limited as it is.
Right, and as sad as it is, like we'll get to, is an incredibly compelling story. I don't think we're going to get to Osceola's death in this episode. I'm not sure. I don't know how far this chapter goes. So you keep driving. All right. Sorry to derail you.
Yeah, I'll keep going. So it shows in Florida, it's revealed really that race is a social construct, and even Governor Duval really concedes this when he refers to this group of people called Indian Negroes. And even more perplexing to that is the existence of this group of people called Black Seminoles. Today, this term seems self-contradictory because race runs too deep in the American psyche to be understood as a social construct. Even though today, as they did back then, many American blacks have more European than African blood. Like Indian and mixed-race Seminoles, Black Seminoles, beneath the complexities of their interrelationships with each other and with white Americans, were simply Americans who refused to accept the identities slaveholder America sought to impose on them. Gad Humphries, who, as Indian agent, got to know the Seminoles very well, discovered the prevailing categorizations were inapplicable. Slaves in name, he observed, they work only when it suits their inclination. General Edmund Gaines, who shared Jackson's racial convictions, regarded them as black vassals and allies of the Indians. So it was the spectacle of blacks, Indians, and even some white people amicably coexisting that made Florida such a post of annoyance. Because Florida continued to annoy them, white Americans would continue devastating Florida for decades. By the time they were finished, virtually every one of these non-white persons in Florida had been killed, enslaved, physically removed from Florida, or driven into the Everglades. Jackson's 1818 rampage had really only expanded the Seminole settlement in Florida, and driven deeper into Florida by the terror, black, Indian, and mixed-race refugees became true pioneers, establishing more than 30 peaceful, multiracial settlements. One of those settlements was even called Peter McQueen's Village, according to an 1821 U.S. intelligence report. That was the village that Osceola would have grown up in. In 7 years, McQueen and his connections, including the future Osceola, had migrated some 500 miles south from Tuskegee to the Peace River Valley. Distance did not provide refuge. Starting in 1824, Duval set out to deprive the inhabitants of McQueen's village of their fishing grounds and gardens and force them inland into the confinement and concentration area. Unwilling to live under white suppression, Osceola's uncle was hoping to escape to the Bahamas when Peter McQueen died on a little barren island on the Atlantic side of Cape Florida. It may have been future Miami Beach, Key Largo, or Key Biscayne. Whatever the location, McQueen stands alone on that desolate shore. Like Ribot at the Matanzas Inlet and Garcon at Fort Negro, he is a hero whose story deserved to be sung by the Floridian Homer. Instead, his odyssey vanished into the sand as the water flowed past him. The water that in Florida outlasts everything.
Yeah, and we say that actually while we're in the course of a historic drought here down in the state of Florida. And to give another bit of color without doxing myself, I think I've alluded to this detail before, but there is a town near me that was founded by a family that the father participated in the Florida Patriot Wars, and then the son, who is the actual founder of said town, went on to participate in the Second Seminole War and then the Civil War on the side of the Confederacy, if you can believe it. But that is, I imagine not a unique story even. I bet there's actually a couple towns in Florida with similar stories, so hopefully that's, vague enough, but there is at least one town I'm aware of with that exact story, and I know it very well, and it, I think, is emblematic of the kind of, social milieu of people we're seeing, and the sort of divide between that, white Protestant, that, at least the family I have in mind. They're a family of, I think Protestant ministers, too. No, Methodist leaders. But regardless, there's just a real, beautiful and complicated and also very dark on some sides. Dark in, a very malicious, predatory sort of way. And, I think Billy Powell's, just an incredible character from history, right. Osceola. And I'm excited to tell a story.
Yeah, Osceola has always been fascinating to the American mind, and part of that is all the contradictions that are rife with his identity, and the fact that we do recognize him now in hindsight to have many of those values we talked about, like loving freedom and hating injustice, that we often associate with our own founders. And they talk about how Osceola, in many ways, is really he was caused by Andrew Jackson. And there's a story of Jackson that his biographer Schlesinger brings up, that really it's very similar to how Osceola begins as well. It says, in the Revolution, an English officer had slashed Jackson with a saber for refusing to clean a pair of boots. And then Schlesinger much later wrote, by way of explaining why, forever after, Andrew Jackson had no truck with anyone who got in his way. That the same injustices should provoke the same outrage in non-whites was something most Americans found it difficult to fathom back then. Osceola's behavior was proclaimed a mystery. The explanation was that he was a half-breed.
Yeah.
The events in Florida actually demonstrated that injustice is colorblind. As a result of American brutality, full-blooded Indians like the Seminole leader Micanopy and blacks like Abraham, the most respected of the Seminole statesmen, as well as mixed-race people like Billy Powell, all became militants and fought together. Americans still believe no major slave revolt ever occurred within the U.S., but in Florida, starting in late 1835, a great slave revolt did erupt. Americans believe their Indian wars were fought out west, but in Florida, beginning in 1835, the longest Indian war in U.S. history entered its bloodiest stage. Like the Seminoles themselves, the conflict was a product of all the tumultuous forces unleashed in the creation of the U.S. Like the whites they fought, the Seminoles were a new people, created by the special circumstances at the time they arose. That was why this was a new kind of American war. And it does say that the Seminole identity, the first mention of it was during the American Revolution. There is no documented mentioning of that group before that. So it is clear that the birth of American nationalism quite literally did create the Seminole people. And they were, in fact, a reaction. They did not exist as the Irving story. Washington Irving had claimed that the Seminole people lived there forever. No, that wasn't actually true. It was very inhospitable and highly dispersed. We said a few chapters back that very few people, probably, I think it was under 5,000 people, may have lived in the state of Florida at the time of its discovery.
It's one of those things, discovery, quote unquote, but it's like a lot of people lived in Florida, but they were not living there all the time. That's really what it was. It was like just a place where you could stop and fish and have a really nice life certain times of the year, but you weren't going to like set up shop and be there all
people didn't
hurricane
permanently
season.
settle there.
All right, not because it just wasn't good for that. And actually, it was great for temporary settlement. It was like perfect for that. It was easy to come and go. There's fish everywhere. The materials with which to build things were relatively abundant and light. And there were more permanent structures that were built, absolutely, too, and more permanent societies and settlements that existed, the creek being among them. But it was not populated with the density it would become later on. It continues to rise. Like that's just a thing.
Yeah, Allman says also in this chapter that the reason the Seminole people lived and flourished there ultimately was because they were not living for an extractive lifestyle. They were living simply to feed their families as a means of survival. And because there was nowhere else, as we said, they didn't fit in with white people up north and they didn't really fit in with other tribes. So they had nowhere else to settle. And they found that they could settle in Florida. They asked for plows because they had come to adapt many of the modern technologies at the time. So they were situated somewhere between Native American tribes and the newly emerging American identity.
And a lot of it was racial. A lot of it was racial. A lot of it was
they
just
had to
like
find
you
a place
are a
they
part
could
of a
live.
racial group that doesn't fit into the American fabric, but you're also close enough that you have some relationship with that. So.
So they were able to survive because they wanted mere survival and they didn't live with the plans to turn it into a profit.
Own all the real estate. Yeah,
they weren't planning to export goods for maximum profit or anything like that. So to them, it was not a failure. It was a success because they were surviving there. And it was only seen by men like Jackson who were failing to export and things like that they said, how the hell could you turn this place into a profit? Yeah, so we're getting a little long on this episode. We could continue.
I was going to say, why don't we cut it off here and then come back in sort of in the middle of Chapter 10, because I didn't realize how much Chapter 10 gets into the Second Seminole War, and I do think that kind of merits its own episode. So, I'd say 1.5 chapters, not a bad...
Yeah, and we might be able to get through Chapter 11 in the following one.
Yeah,
which is called
we're going to try our best. We're going to try our best. We hope you're enjoying, dear listener. We're certainly having fun here. I'm trying to think of a good little quote here to close the episode out on. But overall, it's like we have seen deception after deception by the new federal government imposing its will on the territory of the Florida Peninsula. And the circumstances under which that government even came to be dominant, or like the sovereign leadership of that territory, are already very tenuous. Especially for like any of the Spanish-speaking or the freed slave people or indigenous people who live there. And they're all pretty well set up and situated in those regions in between like, Jacksonville, St. Augustine, Tallahassee, Tampa area, like that whole central Florida, Orlando area. They know pretty well, and many of them live there. And it's come to a head via Osceola and his assassination of Wiley Thompson, which salute.
Yeah, that was pretty well deserved, to be honest.
Pretty cool. Yeah, we talked about a lot of bad guys in here. Osceola, not one of them. Historical cool guy. Let's just one of history's coolest guys, I will say, in America at least, and certainly in Florida history. And that's why what will happen to him will be so sad when we get to it. The story.
Come on, Hollywood! What are you doing? Or Netflix? Make a movie.
Honestly, though, truly, like it is one of those. Like, let's get like an Inglourious Bastards, but for Osceola, and where the director does not become a huge Zionist. So, I mean, regardless. It's an incredible story, and we're gonna fill it in with some more detail and color and scenery. And,
sound effects
even, right? Because it's we need like we need some more dedicated like mosquito effects, things like that. We'll talk about that off mic.
We'll that.
Yeah, the war of the Second Seminole War is a fascinating episode of history that is grossly downplayed because it doesn't make the U.S. look good, and there's a lot of layers to that. And if you think the U.S. can look a lot worse, considering what's already happened,
just wait till you hear the rest of the story.
And then again, remember, at this point in the story we're telling, we're more or less 30 years away from the American Civil War. So none of this stuff, like when you're learning Civil War history in the rest of the United States, none of this stuff gets brought into it. And yet, as we tell the story, I hope you'll see how utterly inseparable all of this is from the story of the Civil War and the story of slavery in the United States. I don't know what your thoughts on that are, but I felt that very strongly, that this was like a whole new layer to the story of slavery in America.
Yeah, it's like Lafayette said, who also happened to be erased from history. Lafayette said,
yeah, after he stopped liking America, right?
I would have never drawn a sword for this land if I had known I was founding a land of slavery. And we don't really like to teach that.
Yeah, right, exactly. And I think slavery persisted in Florida for several years even after the end of the Civil War because of its continued sort of tenuous relationship with the rest of the U.S., because that's just one. The thing about history that's just part of the whole nature of dialectical materialism is that, like, history has these sort of, like, patterns and tendencies and, like, channels and flows that once they get started, they kind of like exceed human will in the ability. Not that like it can't be changed, but it's a process that can be frustratingly difficult. And it's not that we're unable to shape history at all, but it is something that the more you look at it, the more you realize that like a lot of the same stuff happens over and over again. And Florida is a place just like that. Like it's endless, the repetition of these like nightmare stories that play out. But I don't know, we're trying to have fun with it.
Yeah, as I said, Thomas, the guy who got killed and scalped by the Indians, he was able to basically speed run the cycle within 25 months or just over 2 years. Was able to play out the whole cycle of Jeffersonian to Jacksonian violence.
Yeah, the rate of like this cyclical time phenomena is so dizzying in Florida that it almost becomes like comedic. And so I hope that the tone we're striking here doesn't come off as kind of like too light for what we're talking about, because we understand how dark and miserable these things are, and especially for the people who were the direct victims of them and their ancestors.
Yeah.
But it's just fascinating to see these patterns, how deep they run, and how much we've missed out on understanding these in our understanding of the history of the country overall. And I think the Civil War especially, you're going to really see how the Seminole War really connects to the Civil War. And so we'll save that for the next episode. You got anything you want to say before we sign off here, bud?
No, that's all. We've gone on long enough.
Yeah?
Yeah, I'm good. I think we've gone on for plenty of time here.
Yeah, you're going to have a fun time editing this one. But
yeah, right.
As always, thank you for listening. If you've made it this far, thank you for coming to Florida with us. We hope you put on your sunscreen. And as always, this might be the last episode too. So just remember that. You never know. It could be. I hope not, because we got to finish this series at least. But yeah, it's always I feel less worried about that these days, but always a possibility. So until next time, we'll listen again soon. Bye.
Bye.
We don't highlight the means, so we settle for them greens. Yeah, I'll highlight the trees when I send it to my knees. I don't sway with the breeze, they can send me to my knees, yeah.